The galaxy has 3 unbreakable rules. Don't stare into a dying pulsar, don't bargain with a desperate smuggler, and never, under any circumstances, approach a dread worm. These beasts are walking extinction events, armored in razor scales, and fueled by predatory rage. When one breached the security perimeter of the Hastings Interstellar Mining Colony, hardened alien veterans dropped their weapons and wept, waiting for the inevitable end. But they didn't account for a 5-year-old human boy named Leo. What happened next didn't just break the 3rd rule of the galaxy. It shattered everything the universe thought it knew about apex predators and the strange, terrifying empathy of humanity. The official records filed by Hastings Interstellar claim that Outpost 31, located on the desolate ice moon of Aegis VII, was primarily a deep core drilling facility. This was a lie. The drilling was merely a cover operation for something entirely different, a biological containment site. Hastings, a private conglomerate known for absorbing smaller aerospace firms like Galloway Dynamics and the Blackwood Enterprise, had found something buried deep within the permafrost. They called it Subject Zero. But the alien laborers working alongside the humans had another name for it, the World Eater. To the human staff, it was simply the Dragon. Dr. Thomas Harding was the lead xenobiologist on Aegis VII, a former professor at Johns Hopkins University before the Earth Expansion Initiative. Thomas was a man of science, reason, and meticulous documentation. He wasn't prone to exaggeration, yet his private audio logs described the creature with a sense of theological dread. It was 40 feet of articulated obsidian black armor, possessing 6 limbs, a tail that could shear through reinforced steel bulkheads, and a massive wedge-shaped head lined with serrated mandibles. It was a biologically perfect killing machine, hibernating in the ice for what carbon dating suggested was over 2 million years. Working alongside Dr. Harding was a contingent of alien mercenaries hired for security. They belonged to a species humans informally called the silicates, towering bipedal beings with hardened carapaces and a strict honor-bound warrior culture. To facilitate communication, the human crew gave them Western names. The alien security chief, a 7-foot veteran of the Orion skirmishes, went by the name Victor. His second-in-command was named Gideon. These were creatures who had seen entire planets burn, who viewed fear as a biological flaw to be trained out of a soldier. Yet, whenever Victor stood behind the 3-foot thick Plastel observation window looking down at the frozen dragon, his mandibles would click in a rhythmic, involuntary spasm. It was an ancient genetic terror. "Your corporate masters do not understand what they are holding, Doctor," Victor told Thomas one evening, his voice modulated through a translation collar that gave him a deep synthetic baritone. In our oldest texts, from before we had achieved spaceflight, we have carvings of these beasts. They do not hunt for sustenance. They hunt to silence the world around them. If it wakes, there will be no evacuation. Thomas wiped a smudge from his wire-rimmed glasses, sighing heavily. The Sullivan-Finch cryogenerators are pumping liquid helium into that chamber at a constant rate, Victor. It's essentially in a state of suspended animation. It's not waking up. But Thomas was tired, distracted, and grieving. He was raising his 5-year-old son, Leo, on this miserable ice rock after his wife, Clara, had passed away from a sudden autoimmune failure a year prior. Leo was a quiet, deeply observant child. He possessed an almost unnatural calmness, wandering the sterile, metallic halls of the outpost with his favorite possession, a worn-out, stuffed golden retriever named Barnaby. Because of the strict quarantine protocols, Leo had never seen a real dog. His entire world consisted of men in hazmat suits, towering alien warriors who awkwardly tried to avoid stepping on him, and the hum of the colony's life support systems. The outpost was a pressure cooker. The Hastings executives back on Earth were demanding live tissue samples, pushing the on-site to slowly raise the temperature in the containment chamber just enough to thaw the outer dermal layers of the beast. Thomas fought them tooth and nail. He cited the Chernobyl disaster. He cited the catastrophic failure of the Bhopal plant in the 1980s, historical precedents of corporate hubris leading to unimaginable catastrophe. But his protests were overruled by the site director, a ruthless company man named Arthur Sterling. "We need a viable sample, Dr. Harding," Sterling had ordered during a tense meeting on a Tuesday morning. "Drop the core temperature by 3 degrees. That's an order." It was a fatal miscalculation. The Hastings engineers assumed the dragon's biology functioned like standard carbon-based life forms, requiring a slow, gradual awakening. They didn't realize that the creature's internal organs operated like a hyper-pressurized fusion reactor. The moment the external ice thawed even a fraction, the beast's nervous system rebooted in a microsecond. At 14:00 hours, the primary containment alarms began to scream. The sound of the outpost's warning siren was a high-pitched, oscillating shriek designed to cut through the heavy machinery noise of the lower decks. In the command center, warning lights washed the room in a strobing, violent red. "Doctor." Thomas Harding dropped his datapad, the screen cracking against the grated floor. "Report. What's the status of the cryo-generators?" "Generators 1 through 4 are failing," shouted Jenkins, a young technician whose hands were shaking violently over his console. "The thermal output in the chamber. It's impossible. It's spiking to 600 degrees C." Victor, the alien security chief, stepped forward, his massive hands gripping the edge of the console. Through the thick plastel window looking down into the containment pit, a cloud of blinding white steam was billowing upward. The ice was sublimating, instantly turning from solid to gas, and then a sound echoed through the facility. It wasn't a roar, it was a deep, resonant hum, so low in frequency that the humans didn't so much hear it as feel it in their dental fillings and the marrow of their bones. It was the sound of a living earthquake. Thump. A massive obsidian claw slammed against the reinforced plastel window. Spiderweb cracks, impossibly deep, instantly radiated outward from the point of impact. "It cannot be." Gideon, the alien second in command, whispered. He took a stumbling step backward. For the first time since Thomas had met him, the towering alien looked small. A strange, pungent scent filled the room. The pheromones of absolute. Paralyzing panic secreted by the silicate warriors. "Seal the blast doors!" Arthur Sterling screamed, his corporate bravado instantly evaporating. "Lock down Sector 4. Vent the atmosphere in the chamber. The ventilation shafts are melting." Jenkins cried out, tears streaming down his face. Thump, another strike. The plastel bowed inward. Victor turned to his men. He drew his plasma rifle, a weapon capable of punching a hole through a lightly armored tank. "Fall back to the primary corridor. Form a defensive line. If it breaches, we fire until the cell packs are depleted." But as Victor spoke, his voice trembled. His mandibles were locked. The aliens were experiencing something humans called fear lock, an evolutionary glitch where prey animals become completely paralyzed in the presence of an overwhelming predator. The human security personnel, mostly former military contractors, unholstered their weapons, their faces pale, chests heaving in panic, crash. The window exploded outward in a hail of lethal, jagged shrapnel. A shockwave of blistering heat washed over the command center. Through the clearing steam, the dragon pulled itself up from the pit. It was a nightmare pulled from the darkest recesses of the human subconscious. Its scales were matte black, absorbing the emergency lights, making it look like a void cut into reality. Its eyes were burning, molten gold. It moved with a terrifying, serpentine grace, its 6 limbs finding purchase on the sheer metal walls. It didn't immediately attack. It raised its massive, angular head, tasting the air with a forked, flickering tongue. It was analyzing its environment, assessing the threat, finding nothing but prey. Victor opened fire. A searing bolt of blue plasma struck the beast squarely in the chest. The dragon didn't even flinch. The plasma dissipated harmlessly against its armor, leaving not even a scorch mark. The beast slowly turned its golden eyes toward Victor. It let out a sound like grinding tectonic plates, a low hiss that rattled the loose bolts from the ceiling. Panic erupted. Complete unadulterated chaos. Sterling bolted for the emergency exit, shoving a technician out of the way. The human guards opened up with kinetic assault rifles, the bullets sparking and ricocheting off the beast's scales like rain against concrete. The dragon moved. It was too fast for something of its size. In a blur of black motion, its tail swept across the room, shattering consoles and sending 3 human guards flying into the wall with sickening crunches. Gideon, paralyzed by his species' deep-seated genetic terror, simply dropped his rifle and fell to his knees, exposing his throat in an ancient instinct of submission. The beast ignored him, stepping over the cowering alien, as if he were a piece of furniture. Thomas scrambled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to get out. He had to get to the residential wing. Leo. As the dragon tore through the reinforced steel doors of the command center like they were made of wet cardboard, heading into the main arterial hallways of the outpost, Thomas hit the emergency lockdown override on a wall panel. He triggered the evacuation klaxons. Leo! Thomas screamed into his comms link, ignoring the horrific sounds of tearing metal and screaming men behind him. Leo, if you are in the quarters, stay there. Daddy is coming. But static answered him. The beast had severed the primary communication conduits. The deadliest creature in the known universe was now loose in the tight, claustrophobic corridors of Outpost 31, and it was hungry. The evacuation of Outpost 31 was less of a strategic retreat and more of a panicked stampede. Alarms blared relentlessly, the strobing red lights casting long, terrifying shadows against the corrugated metal walls. In the primary hangar bay, where the evacuation shuttles were prepped, over 50 people, a mix of human engineers and terrified alien laborers, were clustered together. Victor and a handful of his remaining security forces had managed to retreat to the hangar, establishing a desperate, flimsy barricade of cargo crates. Thomas burst into the hangar, his lab coat stained with soot and grease, his eyes wild. He grabbed the nearest human technician by the shoulders. "My son! Where is Leo? Did the residential block evacuate?" The technician shook his head frantically. "I don't know, Doc." The blast doors shut automatically. Anyone who didn't make it out is trapped. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He turned back toward the hallway, ready to sprint into the jaws of death, when a small, quiet voice echoed from the opposite side of the massive hangar bay. Daddy. Thomas froze. He turned slowly. There, standing near the loading ramp of Shuttle Alpha, was little Leo. He was wearing his oversized blue pajamas, clutching Barnaby the stuffed dog tightly against his chest. He had somehow wandered into the hangar before the lockdown procedures had sealed the corridors. "Leo!" Thomas gasped, profound relief washing over him. He took a step toward his son. "Stay right there, buddy. Daddy's coming to get you." But before Thomas could cross the distance, the heavy blast-resistant doors leading to the engineering wing began to bulge inward. The metal groaned in agony. Victor raised a trembling hand, aiming his weapon at the door. "Do not move," the alien whispered, his voice cracking. "It is here." The massive doors ripped off their hinges, flying across the hangar and crashing into a forklift. The dragon stepped into the hangar bay. In the vast cavernous space of the hangar, the sheer scale of the beast was fully realized. It stood 15 feet tall at the shoulder, its long, muscular neck weaving back and forth, its molten gold eyes locked onto the huddled mass of survivors. The aliens in the room immediately dropped to the floor, their bodies instinctively shutting down. Victor, the bravest warrior Thomas had ever known, slowly lowered his weapon, his knees buckling. He was weeping. Thick, viscous tears of biological surrender rolled down his hardened face. The humans were equally paralyzed, trapped in the corner like rats in a cage. The dragon let out a low, vibrating growl. It took a heavy, deliberate step toward the crowd, but it was between the crowd and Leo. Thomas felt his vocal cords paralyzed. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. to throw himself between the monster and his child, but his body wouldn't obey. The sheer, overwhelming aura of apex predation radiating from the beast was suffocating. Then Leo moved. He didn't run toward the shuttle. He didn't scream. He walked forward. Leo's small, bare feet patted softly against the cold metal decking. He was looking up at the towering obsidian nightmare with wide, curious eyes. To Leo, who had never known cruelty, who had spent his life watching holograms of Earth's wildlife, this wasn't a monster. To his innocent, uncorrupted 5-year-old brain, this was simply a very large, very scary-looking animal that had been locked in a cold box for a long time. Leo. No, Thomas whispered, the words barely a breath. The dragon stopped its advance. It lowered its massive head, its golden eyes zeroing in on the tiny, fragile creature walking toward it. The beast's mandibles parted, revealing rows of teeth that could bite through titanium. Hot, sulfurous breath washed over the boy, fluttering his pajama top. Victor squeezed his eyes shut, unable to watch. He braced for the horrific sound of a child being torn apart. Leo stopped 3 feet from the dragon's snout. The beast's head was the size of a minivan hovering just inches above the boy. It let out a sharp warning hiss, a sound that made the air itself vibrate. Leo tilted his head. He looked into the terrifying golden eyes of the apex predator. "You're sad," the boy said softly. His voice was a stark, jarring contrast to the deafening blare of the alarms. The dragon blinked. The violent twitching of its tail ceased. Leo lifted his arms, holding out Barnaby, the stuffed dog. "You were in the cold room." "I don't like the cold room either." The beast lowered its snout further until it was practically touching the boy's chest. It sniffed the stuffed animal, then exhaled a deep gust of air that knocked Leo backward onto his bottom. Thomas lunged forward, finally breaking through his paralysis, but he tripped over a cable sprawling hard onto the grated floor. Leo didn't cry. He simply giggled, stood back up, and did the unthinkable. The boy reached out with his small, pale hands and placed them firmly on the tip of the beast's armored, razor-sharp snout. Every human and alien in the hangar stopped breathing. The silence in the room was absolute, cutting through the sirens. Leo leaned in, puckered his lips, and planted a gentle, resounding kiss on the dragon's nose. "It's okay now," Leo whispered, patting the cold obsidian scales. "You don't have to be mad." The dragon froze. For a creature engineered by nature over millions of years to be the ultimate weapon, an organism that understood only dominance, violence, and the hunt, this was a catastrophic error in its processing. It had no instinctual response for empathy. It had no genetic memory of gentleness. The beast's massive pupils dilated. A low rumbling sound began to emanate from its chest. Victor tensed, assuming it was the prelude to an attack. But the sound wasn't a growl. It was a purr. A deep, rhythmic vibration that shook the floorboards, completely devoid of aggression. The dragon closed its molten gold eyes and leaned its tremendous weight forward, gently resting its heavy armored chin against the deck right at Leo's feet, effectively bowing to the 5-year-old child. Victor opened his eyes, staring in absolute shattered disbelief. He looked at Dr. Thomas Harding, who was pulling himself off the floor, tears streaming down his face. The deadliest creature in the universe wasn't tamed by plasma fire or reinforced steel. It was conquered by a child in blue pajamas who simply thought it needed a hug. The silence in the hangar bay was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, bass-heavy thrumming of the dragon's purr. It sounded like an idling starship engine vibrating through the metal floor grates and rattling the loose tools on the distant workbenches. Dr. Thomas Harding remained on his hands and knees, staring at the impossible tableau before him. His 5-year-old son, Leo, was casually stroking the reinforced obsidian snout of a creature that just moments ago had been tearing through a billion-dollar mining facility like wet tissue paper. The beast's eyes, pools of molten glowing gold, were half closed in what could only be described as absolute contentment. "Leo," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking so violently he barely recognized it. He slowly pushed himself up, keeping his movements painfully deliberate. "Leo, buddy, It's time to come to Daddy now. Step away from it. Leo looked over his shoulder, his face bright and completely devoid of the paralyzing terror gripping the adults. But he's nice, Dad. He just had a bad dream in the cold box. Look, he likes Barnaby. To prove his point, Leo pressed the worn-out stuffed golden retriever against the beast's cheek. The dragon responded by letting out a soft huff of air, closing its eyes entirely, and nudging the stuffed toy with its massive, razor-lined jaw. I see that, sweetie, Thomas coaxed, taking one agonizingly slow step forward. The heat radiating from the creature was intense, like standing too close to an open blast furnace. But we need to go now. Come here. As Thomas closed the distance to within 10 feet, the dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The dragon's eyes snapped open. The deep, rumbling purr stopped dead, replaced by a sharp metallic click from the back of its throat. The massive head rose, towering over Leo, and positioned itself firmly between the boy and his father. The beast didn't attack, but it let out a low, warning hiss. Its 6 limbs tensed, its carbon fiber like muscles bunching under its thick scales. It was a clear, unmistakable biological boundary. You may not take him, Thomas froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Fascinating, a voice whispered from the back of the room. Arthur Sterling, the site director for Hastings Interstellar, had crawled out from beneath a reinforced cargo loader. His earlier panic was rapidly evaporating, replaced by the toxic, opportunistic gleam of corporate greed. He looked at the beast, then at the child, and then at the heavily armed security team still cowering in the corner. It's imprinted on the boy, Sterling muttered, his mind working in overdrive. The sudden temperature shift, the disorientation of waking up after 2 million years, it's exhibiting extreme maternal or pack bonding behavior. It thinks the child is its hatchling. Sterling stood up, straightening his soiled corporate suit. Victor, he barked, his voice echoing in the tense hangar, have your men power up their plasma rifles. Aim for the soft tissue under the jaw. While it's distracted by the kid, we can put it down and salvage the carcass. Victor, the towering silicate security chief, slowly turned his massive head to look at Sterling. The alien's mandibles twitched in absolute disgust. Are you malfunctioning? Human, Victor asked, his synthesized voice dripping with venom. To fire upon that beast now would guarantee the child's death. It will not fall to a single volley, and its final act will be a reflex of pure destruction. I am giving you a direct order, Commander, Sterling shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the alien. That is corporate property, and if we can't secure it alive, we secure the corpse. Fire your weapons. Before Victor could respond, the dragon did. The beast had heard the sudden elevation in Sterling's voice. It recognized the sharp, aggressive cadence of the human's tone. To an apex predator, aggression directed at its pack was the ultimate trigger. The dragon moved with a speed that defied its massive bulk. It didn't step, it flowed. In a fraction of a second, the beast bypassed Thomas's entirely and lunged across the hangar. It slammed its massive forelimbs onto the deck just inches from where Sterling stood, shattering the reinforced plating and sending a shockwave that knocked the corporate director flat on his back. The beast towered over Sterling, its jaws opening to reveal rows of serrated, jagged teeth. Drool, highly acidic and smoking as it hit the floor, dripped from its maw. It let out a roar, not a purr, not a hiss, but a deafening, concussive blast of pure fury that shattered the remaining intact glass in the hangar bay. Sterling scrambled backward, whimpering, a warm patch of urine spreading across his trousers. Stop! The voice was tiny, but it cut through the chaos like a scalpel. Leo dropped Barnaby and ran forward, his bare feet slapping against the metal floor. He stopped right beside the beast's massive hind leg and smacked the creature's armored flank with his small hand. No! Bad! Leo scolded, his brow furrowed in a 5-year-old's version of intense authority. We do not yell at people. Leave him alone. The entire room held its breath. Victor gripped his rifle, certain he was about to witness a tragedy. The dragon stopped its roaring. It looked down at the tiny human slapping its leg. Slowly, almost apologetically, the beast stepped back from the terrified Sterling. It lowered its head, whined a sound that sounded bizarrely like a scolded dog, and nudged Leo's shoulder. Victor slowly lowered his weapon, his alien mind struggling to process the impossible data before him. His species had spent thousands of years studying the art of war, the science of dominance, and the hierarchy of predators. But humanity possessed something utterly terrifying. They had a pathological need to pack bond with the universe. Humans would look at a walking extinction event, a creature that had undoubtedly wiped out entire planetary ecosystems, and a human child would simply decide it was a friend, and the universe, inexplicably, bent to the child's will. "Nobody shoots," Thomas finally commanded, his voice finding its strength. He glared at Sterling, who was still trembling on the floor. "Nobody makes a sudden movement. The beast stays with the boy. We clear Sector 4 and make a habitat. Until rescue arrives, my son is the only thing keeping us alive." 3 weeks passed. In that time, Outpost 31 transformed from a high-tech mining facility into the most bizarre, terrifying, and peaceful sanctuary in the galaxy. The dragon, whom Leo had officially named Buster, had claimed the primary cargo bay as its den. It refused to return to the cryogenic chamber. Hastings engineers, operating under Thomas's strict supervision and Victor's heavily armed watch, had rerouted the station's climate controls to keep the cargo bay comfortably warm. The dynamic between the beast and the boy was a subject of endless fascination for Dr. Harding. Thomas had set up a makeshift laboratory behind a reinforced blast shield, recording hours of footage. He watched as Buster, a creature capable of biting a transport shuttle in half, would spend hours delicately trying to pick up a plastic building block with its massive razor-sharp claws just to hand it to Leo. When Leo slept, curled up on a pile of blankets in the center of the bay, Buster would coil its massive 40-feet body around the child, creating an impenetrable fortress of obsidian scales. The alien mercenaries had undergone a profound cultural shift. To the silicates, the dragon was a mythological god of death. To see it brought to heel by a fragile human child completely shattered their worldview. Victor and his men began to treat Leo with a quiet, profound reverence. When they walked past the cargo bay, they would bow their heads. They no longer called Leo by his name. In their native tongue, they referred to him as the Sun Tamer. But the peace was an illusion. The isolation of Aegis VII was about to be violently interrupted. The proximity alarms in the command center began to wail on the 21st day. A massive shadow eclipsed the outpost's external cameras as a heavy cruiser descended through the moon's thin atmosphere. It was a Hastings Interstellar corporate dreadnought, the Deadliest. Thomas stood in the command center, his stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. He knew Arthur Sterling had managed to send a scrambled burst transmission before the Dragon had severed the main comms, but he hadn't expected a response of this magnitude. The Daedalus wasn't a rescue ship. It was a heavily armed military vessel. Within an hour, the dreadnought had locked onto the outpost docking ring. The airlock hissed open, and a squad of heavily armored corporate operatives marched in. They wore matte gray tactical suits, armed with heavy neural disruptor rifles. At their head was Director William Rourke, a man with cold, dead eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Rourke didn't offer a greeting. He walked straight up to Thomas, flanked by his men. "Dr. Harding, you've clear as throat done an impressive job keeping the asset intact. We will take over from here." "The asset?" Thomas stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Listen to me, Rourke. You cannot move that creature. It has formed an unbreakable psychological bond with my son. If you try to cage it, it will tear this station apart." Rourke offered a thin, patronizing smile. "We are well aware of the situation, Doctor. Director Sterling's reports were quite detailed. The beast's anomalous attachment to the child is precisely what makes it viable. We couldn't transport it when it was a waking nightmare. But a compliant, docile weapon? That is worth billions. Victor stepped out of the shadows, his massive 7 feet frame towering over the corporate executives. You do not understand the balance here, human. The beast is not tame. It is merely humoring the child. If you threaten the boy or attempt to force the creature, you will awaken the World Eater. Rourke barely glanced at the alien. Stand down, mercenary. Your contract is terminated. He turned back to his strike team. Commander Hayes, execute Protocol Delta, secure the asset. Thomas felt his blood run cold. Protocol Delta. He knew the corporate handbook. No, Protocol Delta requires separating the biological tether. You can't use my son as bait. Restrain him, Rourke ordered coldly. Two massive operatives grabbed Thomas by the arms, dragging him back as he screamed and thrashed. Commander Hayes and a squad of 12 elite operatives moved toward the cargo bay. They didn't carry lethal weapons. They carried heavy, industrial-grade neural inhibitor nets, devices designed to short-circuit the nervous system of megafauna. In the cargo bay, Leo was sitting cross-legged on the floor, attempting to teach Buster how to play fetch with a wrench. The beast was watching the boy with deep, golden intensity, occasionally snorting a puff of warm air. The heavy blast doors slid open. Hayes and his men fanned out, their boots clanking heavily against the metal grate. Buster immediately sensed the intrusion. The beast's head snapped up. It didn't growl, but its body language changed instantly. The relaxed, lazy posture vanished, replaced by the coiled, terrifying tension of a predator preparing to strike. It stepped over Leo, shielding the boy completely with its massive front legs. Target the beast's sensory nodes. Hayes barked over his comms. Fire the inhibitors. No! Leave him alone! Leo screamed, jumping to his feet and trying to push past Buster's leg. 6 neural nets crackling with millions of volts of blue electricity shot across the room. They struck the dragon squarely in the chest and neck. For a normal biological entity, the voltage would have instantly paralyzed the nervous system, dropping the creature into a deep, comatose state. Buster didn't even blink. The beast looked down at the sparking nets clinging to its scales. It seemed more confused than hurt. Then it looked at the men who had fired them. It looked at the men who were currently raising their weapons toward Leo. The universe seemed to hold its breath. The bond between human and monster was a fragile, unprecedented anomaly. The Hastings operatives assumed they were dealing with a dumb animal that could be shocked into submission. They failed to realize that by attacking the beast in front of the child, they hadn't just broken the peace. They had ignited a war. Buster let out a sound that Thomas Harding, listening from the command center, would never forget. It was a scream of pure, unadulterated cosmic rage. The beast's golden eyes flared with a blinding, incandescent light, and the temperature in the room instantly skyrocketed. The inhibitor nets melted off its body, turning into useless slag. "Fall back!" Hayes screamed, realizing his fatal miscalculation. "Lethal force!" But it was far, far too late. The World Eater had awoken, and this time it was protecting its own. Commander Hayes was a veteran of the bloody frontier skirmishes, a man who had survived insurgencies on Mars and deep space piracy raids. He was equipped with the best gear money could buy. His tactical armor was an advanced, impact-resistant weave derived from classified DuPont patents, and his rifle fired depleted uranium slugs powered by Raytheon microaccelerators. He was trained to handle any biological threat in the known galaxy. But as the heavy, industrial-grade neural nets melted into useless, bubbling slag against Buster's obsidian scales, Hayes realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that he was not facing a biological threat. He was facing a force of nature. Buster did not lunge immediately. The dragon possessed an intelligence that defied Hastings Interstellar's primitive categorization. It understood trajectory, line of sight, and the fragility of the tiny human standing beneath its chest. With a movement so smooth it blurred the human eye, the beast swept its massive, armored tail around, gently but firmly scooping Leo behind a stack of reinforced titanium shipping crates. The boy was shielded from the line of fire and, more importantly, shielded from what was about to happen. Open fire, all units. Suppressive fire. Hayes screamed, backing away as he brought his heavy rifle to bear. 12 elite corporate operatives unleashed a torrential hail of armor-piercing rounds. The noise was deafening, a staccato roar that shook the very foundations of the hangar bay. Sparks showered the room as uranium slugs slammed into Buster's hide. On any other creature, this concentrated firepower would have liquefied internal organs and shattered bone. On Buster, it merely ruined the polish of its scales. The World Eater dropped its head, its molten gold eyes narrowing into slits of pure, incandescent rage. It let out a sound, not a roar, but a high-frequency acoustic pulse. The shockwave visibly rippled through the air, instantly shattering the visors of the operatives' helmets and blowing out the acoustic dampeners in their earpieces. Several men dropped to their knees, clutching their bleeding ears in agony. Then, the beast struck. It was a masterclass in apex lethality. Buster did not swat them away like pests. It dismantled the squad with terrifying surgical precision. Its jaws snapped forward, bypassing the heavily armored torso of the nearest operative, and instead crushing the man's kinetic battery backpack. The zolting, localized explosion sent 3 other soldiers flying across the hangar. The beast's forelimbs, tipped with claws sharper than surgical scalpels, sheared through the DuPont armor plating as if it were wet parchment. Blood and ozone filled the air. The smell of burning circuits mixed with the coppery tang of death. Up in the command center, Director William Rourke watched the feed from the hangar bay with widening, horrified eyes. The feed was staticky, glitching every time the beast moved, as if the dragon's very biology emitted an electromagnetic dampening field. "This is impossible," Rourke whispered, stepping back from the monitors. He grabbed Dr. Thomas Harding by the collar of his lab coat, shoving a sleek silver sidearm under the scientist's chin. "Call it off. Tell the boy to call it off, Harding, or I will paint this console with your brains." Thomas, despite the gun trembling at his throat, let out a harsh, broken laugh. "You arrogant fool. You think Leo commands it like a circus animal? He didn't tame it. He just offered it kindness. You came in here and threatened its child. There is no off switch for what you've just woken up." Down in the arterial hallways outside the hangar bay, Hastings' reinforcements were pouring out of the Deadliest airlocks, heavily armed and rushing to support Hayes' decimated squad. But they found their path blocked. Victor, the towering Silicate security chief, stood in the center of the main corridor. Behind him stood Gideon and the remaining alien mercenaries, their plasma rifles fully charged and aimed dead at the advancing human corporate soldiers. "Move aside, mercenary!" the lead Hastings captain shouted. "You are interfering with a corporate asset retrieval." Victor's mandibles clicked, a rhythmic sound of supreme predatory calm. He reached up and slowly detached the Hastings corporate insignia from his chest plate, letting the metal badge clatter onto the grated floor. "We are not mercenaries anymore." Victor's synthesized voice boomed down the corridor, dripping with heavy, unyielding resolve. "We are the vanguard of the Sun Tamer, and you will not touch his guardian." Victor opened fire. A searing, blinding beam of blue plasma completely vaporized the lead Hastings captain's torso. Gideon and the others followed suit, creating an impenetrable wall of suppressing fire that halted the corporate advance in its tracks. For the first time in their long, bloody history, the Silicates were not fighting for territory, for pay, or for conquest. They were fighting to protect the innocence of a 5-year-old human boy. The situation had entirely spiraled out of Hastings Interstellar's control. Within 15 minutes, the heavily armed insertion team had been reduced to a handful of terrified survivors barricaded in the airlock. Director Rourke, his pristine corporate suit now soaked in nervous sweat, realized the outpost was lost. He dragged Thomas by the collar toward the command center's private escape pod bay. "Command, this is Rourke." He barked into his wrist comms, his voice trembling with a cocktail of panic and spite. "The asset is uncontainable. Outpost 31 is compromised. Initiate the Orion Protocol. I repeat, initiate the Orion Protocol. Authorize kinetic bombardment of the facility coordinates. Wipe it all. Thomas's eyes widened in sheer terror. The Orion Protocol. He had read about it in classified data dumps back on Earth, a strategy originally theorized during the Cold War under Project Thor. It involved dropping telephone pole-sized rods of solid tungsten from orbit. There were no explosives, just the sheer catastrophic kinetic energy of gravity and mass. It struck with the force of a tactical nuclear weapon, burying deep into the bedrock and turning everything within a 5-mile radius into vapor and molten slag. You can't do that. Thomas screamed, struggling against Rourke's iron grip. There are innocent people down there. Your own men are still in the airlocks. My son is down there. Your son is collateral damage, Doctor. Rourke snarled, throwing Thomas into the corner of the escape pod. Hastings does not leave behind loose ends. If we can't monetize the World Eater, we will ensure our competitors at Blackwood Enterprise or Galloway Dynamics never find its corpse. Rourke slammed his fist onto the launch sequence button. The heavy glass doors of the pod hissed shut, locking Thomas inside. No, Rourke, please. Thomas pounded his fists against the reinforced glass, watching helplessly as Rourke keyed the final launch sequence from the exterior console. Rourke gave a cold, dismissive salute, turned and bolted for a secondary shuttle. The pod's automated voice chimed, "Ejection in T-10 seconds." Down in the hangar bay, the slaughter had ceased. Buster stood amidst the wreckage of the Hastings strike team, his massive chest heaving. The beast shook a jagged piece of shrapnel from its shoulder, completely unbothered by the superficial scratch. Leo peeked out from behind the titanium crates. He looked at the ruined machinery, the scorch marks on the walls, and the bodies. His 5-year-old brain didn't fully comprehend the violence, but he recognized the stillness. He walked out, his small bare feet stepping carefully over the debris, clutching Barnaby the dog tight to his chest. Buster immediately lowered his massive head, sniffing the boy frantically to ensure he was unharmed. The beast let out a low, anxious croon, gently nudging Leo's cheek with its snout. "I'm okay, Buster," Leo whispered, hugging the thick, cold scales of the dragon's face. "You scared the bad men away." Suddenly, Buster froze, the beast's ears frilled. Sensory appendages along the side of its skull twitched wildly. Its golden eyes darted upward, staring through the thick metal ceiling of the outpost, looking straight into the vacuum of space. Buster possessed sensory organs far beyond human comprehension. The creature could detect shifts in tectonic plates, the electromagnetic hum of distant quasars, and right now it felt the massive, shifting gravity well of the Deadliest dreadnought repositioning itself in low orbit. It felt the heavy, dense mass of the tungsten rods sliding into the orbital launch tubes. The beast knew exactly what was coming. Total annihilation. Buster let out a sharp, urgent hiss. It gently but swiftly grabbed the back of Leo's pajama shirt with its front teeth, much like a mother cat carrying a kitten, and deposited the boy into an empty, heavily reinforced hazard containment locker, slamming the thick steel door shut with its snout. "Buster, it's dark in here," Leo's muffled voice called out from the locker. "Stay." Buster hummed a deep, resonant vibration that sent a wave of unnatural, calming warmth through the metal, soothing the boy instantly. The beast turned its attention to the ceiling. The World Eater crouched low, its 6 muscular limbs digging deeply into the reinforced floor grates, shredding the metal to find purchase on the bedrock below. Up in orbit, the Deadliest fired. 4 tungsten rods, each weighing 10 tons, shot out of the dreadnought's launch tubes. As they entered the thin, icy atmosphere of Aegis VIIs, friction ignited the air around them, turning them into screaming, superheated meteors of death, plummeting toward Outpost 31 at Mach 10. Inside the facility, Buster unleashed a roar that defied the laws of acoustics. It wasn't just sound. It was physical force. The beast launched itself upward with the kinetic energy of a Saturn V rocket. It hit the ceiling of the hangar bay and simply didn't stop. 40 feet of razor-sharp obsidian armor sheared through 30 levels of solid steel, titanium, and permafrost rock like a bullet passing through an apple. Buster erupted from the surface of the ice moon, surrounded by a geyser of shattered ice and twisting metal, launching itself into the freezing, breathless vacuum of space. The beast didn't need oxygen. It didn't fear the void. As the first tungsten rod screamed downward, glowing blindingly white with atmospheric friction, Buster intercepted it. The Hastings bridge crew aboard the Daedalus watched their tactical monitors in horrified disbelief. "Captain," the targeting officer stammered, his face ghostly pale. "The payload, it's been intercepted. Something just hit Rod 1. Intercepted? By what? A surface-to-air battery? No, sir. By a biological mass in the upper atmosphere." Buster collided head-on with the 10-ton Mach 10 projectile. The kinetic impact should have vaporized the beast on an atomic level. Instead, the dragon's scales, a biological metamaterial that absorbed and repurposed kinetic energy, flared with a blinding Cherenkov blue light. The beast wrapped its massive forelimbs around the superheated tungsten rod, redirecting its monumental momentum. With a horrific screech of tearing physics, Buster spun in the microgravity and hurled the rod back the way it came. The tungsten meteor shot back up into orbit, traveling twice as fast as it had descended. It struck the Daedalus dead center. The impact snapped the billion-dollar corporate dreadnought in half. The ship's heavy magnetic shielding, designed by top engineers at Galloway Dynamics, was useless against solid kinetic mass traveling at Mach 20. The dreadnought's fusion core destabilized, blooming into a silent, brilliant supernova of orange and blue fire against the cold backdrop of the cosmos. Down on the surface of Aegis VII, the remaining 3 rods missed the facility entirely, thrown off trajectory by the shockwave, burying themselves deep into the uninhabited ice plains and sending massive shockwaves that rattled the outpost to its bones. Inside the hazard locker, Leo simply hugged Barnaby tighter, humming a little song his mother used to sing him, waiting for his very large, very grumpy dog to come back and let him out. The sky over Aegis VII rained burning metal. The destruction of the Daedalus in low orbit created an artificial meteor shower of staggering proportions, painting the eternal twilight of the ice moon in violent streaks of orange and blue. Debris the size of city blocks slammed into the desolate tundra, shaking the tectonic foundations of Outpost 31. Dr. Thomas Harding's escape pod, prematurely ejected by Director Rourke moments before the dreadnought's destruction, had been violently knocked off its automated trajectory by the concussive shockwave. It plummeted out of control, deploying its Aerojet Rocketdyne retrothrusters a fraction of a second too late. The pod skipped across the jagged permafrost like a skipped stone, violently churning up ice before slamming into a glacial embankment 2 miles from the primary facility. Thomas kicked the emergency release latch, his shoulder dislocated, his forehead bleeding heavily into his eyes. He stumbled out into the freezing, thin atmosphere, his emergency rebreather hissing as it fed him synthetic oxygen. He didn't look at the burning wreckage of the corporate dreadnought falling from the heavens. He only looked toward the smoking, ruined silhouette of Outpost 31. "Leo!" Thomas gasped, clutching his broken arm against his chest. He began to walk. The temperature was 50 degrees below zero, and his lab coat was entirely insufficient, but the primal adrenaline of a terrifyingly desperate father fueled his agonizing march across the ice. Back in the decimated hangar bay, the silence was deafening. The facility's emergency backup generators kicked on, bathing the pulverized room in a sickly dim amber light. Victor, the towering silicate warrior, pushed a 2-ton slab of collapsed ceiling plating off his chest, his bipedal legs trembling with exhaustion. His armor was cracked, and his plasma rifle was drained, but he was alive. He looked around to see Gideon and the rest of his vanguard pulling themselves from the rubble coated in white pulverized dust. A muffled, rhythmic thumping echoed from the far corner of the bay. Victor limped over the ruined corpses of the Hastings corporate soldiers, his optical sensors adjusting to the low light. Buried under a mountain of sheared titanium and twisted piping was the heavy hazard containment locker. The alien commander gripped the red-hot metal handle and hauled the door open. Leo sat inside, completely unharmed, his small arms wrapped tightly around Barnaby, the stuffed golden retriever. The boy blinked against the amber emergency lights. He looked up at the terrifying 7-feet-tall alien warrior covered in dust and blood. "Hi, Mr. Victor," Leo said softly. "Is it safe to come out now? Where is Buster?" Before Victor could answer, the entire outpost shuddered with a massive localized earthquake. Something colossal had just crashed into the ice basin directly outside the hangar's shattered blast doors. Victor scooped Leo into his massive armored arms, holding the boy gently against his chest plate, and walked toward the yawning hole in the facility's exterior. Lying in a crater of boiling, sublimating ice was the World Eater. Buster had survived the vacuum of space. He had survived the kinetic interception of a 10-ton tungsten rod. He had survived the atmospheric re-entry, but the laws of physics demand a toll, and even the universe's ultimate apex predator was not immune to thermal breakdown. The creature's obsidian scales, previously thought impenetrable, were cracked and leaking a glowing luminescent blue fluid, its equivalent of blood. The massive, articulated limbs were awkwardly splayed, and the rhythmic fusion reactor hum of its chest was sputtering, sounding like a failing engine. Buster was dying. "Buster!" Leo screamed, squirming out of Victor's grip. The alien tried to grab him, fearful of the extreme heat radiating from the beast, but Leo was too fast. The 5-year-old slid down the icy embankment, completely ignoring the freezing temperatures, and ran to the creature's massive snout. The dragon's molten gold eyes were dimming, flickering like a dying candle. It let out a weak, agonizing wheeze, a puff of cool gray smoke escaping its serrated mandibles. It couldn't lift its head, but its heavy eyelids shifted to look at the boy. No, you're a good boy." "You can't go to sleep yet," Leo cried, tears streaming down his cheeks, freezing almost instantly in the brutal cold. He pressed his small, bare hands against the beast's cracked, bleeding scales. Thomas finally staggered over the ridge, his breath catching in his throat at the sight. He slid down into the crater, collapsing next to his son. "Dad, fix him. You have to fix him," Leo begged, grabbing his father's ruined lab coat. "He saved us." Thomas looked at the dying Leviathan. As a xenobiologist, he knew this was impossible. The creature's biology was entirely alien, operating under cellular pressures and thermal dynamics that defied human science. But as he looked into the dimming eyes of the monster that had willingly taken a meteor to the chest to save a human child, Thomas Harding realized he had to try. Victor Thomas barked, his scientific mind suddenly overriding his pain. "Get the medical trauma kits from the engineering bay. I need the Moderna biogel, all the Siemens deep tissue coagulants we have, and every liquid nitrogen canister you can carry. Move." The alien mercenaries, creatures bred for war and slaughter, didn't hesitate. They sprinted into the ruined facility like desperate paramedics. For the next 4 hours, the ice crater became the most bizarre surgical theater in the history of the galaxy. Thomas, working with one good arm, directed the towering silicate warriors. They used heavy industrial plasma torches to cauterize the massive fissures in the beast's armor. They dumped gallons of cutting-edge Moderna biogel, normally used to regenerate human limbs, directly into the creature's open wounds, hoping the universal stem cell matrices would adapt to the dragon's biology. To stabilize the creature's failing internal reactor, they used liquid nitrogen hoses to cool the hyperpressurized organs that were melting down from the inside out. Through it all, Leo sat right beside the beast's ear, whispering to it, stroking its snout, and pressing his stuffed dog against the cold, unyielding armor. "Stay with me, buddy," Leo whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'll give you all my toys. You don't have to be in the cold box ever again. As the harsh artificial dawn of Aegis VII broke over the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the wreckage, the sputtering, failing hum deep within Buster's chest finally steadied. The bleeding stopped. The luminescent blue fluid hardened into a thick, protective resin. The beast let out a long, slow exhale. Its molten gold eyes opened, glowing with a renewed, steady light. It couldn't stand up yet, but it shifted its massive head, gently curling its snout around Leo's small body, pulling the exhausted, shivering child into the warmth of its neck. Buster closed its eyes and began to purr. Thomas slumped back against the icy wall of the crater, utterly exhausted, a hysterical laugh escaping his lips. Beside him, Victor, the hardened, lethal veteran of 100 planetary conquests, sat down in the snow, his mandibles clicking in absolute awe. "He lives," Victor whispered, bowing his head. "The Sun Tamer has breathed life back into the god of death." For 6 agonizing days, Outpost 31 sat in absolute localized silence, cut off from the rest of the galaxy. When the United Nations extraterrestrial charter UNIC fleet finally dropped out of slipspace, the sheer scale of the devastation in orbit painted a grim, terrifying picture. Admiral James Caldwell stood on the bridge of the flagship Leviathan, looking out through the reinforced viewport at a literal graveyard of corporate hubris. The billion-dollar dreadnought Deadliest had been snapped completely in half, its shattered hull drifting among frozen clouds of sublimated atmosphere and stray tungsten rods. Caldwell had read the encrypted telemetry bursts intercepted prior to the dreadnought's destruction. He expected to find a dead rock. He expected to drop onto an ice moon completely sterilized by a rampaging apex predator that had breached containment and slaughtered everything with a pulse. When the heavily armored UNEC dropships descended through the violent icy atmosphere and landed heavily on the pulverized tarmac of Outpost 31, hundreds of elite peacekeepers poured down the boarding ramps. They moved in standard, sweeping tactical formations, their heavy Lockheed Martin kinetic rifles raised and locked. They anticipated fighting a monstrous Leviathan, a nightmare of teeth and scale hiding in the ruins. Instead, Admiral Caldwell and his men walked into a scene that would permanently alter the socio-political and psychological landscape of the known universe. The perimeter of the ruined facility was not secured by human survivors, nor was it overrun by a beast. It was held by a phalanx of towering, heavily armed silicate mercenaries. Their armor was cracked, scorched by plasma fire, and hastily patched with industrial sealant, but they stood with absolute unyielding discipline. They did not raise their weapons at the advancing UNEC forces, but they did not step aside either. They formed an impenetrable wall of alien muscle and steel around the shattered entrance of the primary hangar bay. "Hold your fire. Stand down," Caldwell ordered his men, stepping ahead of the peacekeeper line. He looked up at the towering alien commander, recognizing the markings of an Orion skirmish veteran. "I am Admiral Caldwell, United Nations Interstellar Fleet. I am looking for the facility director, Arthur Sterling, or the executive officer of the Deadliest." Victor, leaning heavily on his drained plasma rifle, looked down at the human admiral. The alien's mandibles clicked in a slow, rhythmic cadence of utter calm. "They are dead, or they have fled into the ice like the cowards they are," Victor replied, his synthesized voice echoing coldly across the frozen tundra. "I speak for the Vanguard. You no authority here, Admiral. We answer only to Dr. Harding and to the boy." Caldwell frowned, utterly bewildered by the alien's fierce devotion to a human child. He gestured for his men to lower their weapons entirely and stepped past Victor's massive frame. As he entered the devastated hangar bay, the Admiral stopped dead in his tracks. Behind him, hardened peacekeepers let out collective gasps of sheer, paralyzed disbelief. The hangar was a graveyard of shredded titanium and pulverized concrete, lit only by the sickly amber glow of emergency floodlights. But in the center of the bay, resting upon a massive makeshift nest of thermal transport blankets and salvaged corporate banners, was the World Eater. The dread worm, the biological extinction event that had terrified the galaxy for millennia. It was wrapped tightly in thick synthetic medical bandages. Massive swaths of its obsidian armor were coated in glowing luminescent blue bioresin, slowly knitting its shattered scales back together. And lying sound asleep, perfectly pressed against the creature's slowly rising and falling chest, completely dwarfed by the sheer, terrifying scale of the monster, was a 5-year-old human boy clutching a worn-out stuffed dog. The beast's massive spiked tail was curled protectively over the child like a fortress wall, and one giant razor-sharp claw was delicately, impossibly gently resting just over the boy's stomach. Dr. Thomas Harding walked out from the shadows of a makeshift medical triage center. His arm was secured in a rigid splint, his lab coat was ruined, and he held a steaming mug of synthetic coffee in his good hand. Admiral Caldwell, I presume. Thomas whispered, offering a tired, lopsided smile. Welcome to Aegis VII. I'd ask you to tell your men to keep their voices down. Buster just managed to get back to sleep, and frankly, he's had a very rough week. The fallout from the Aegis VII incident was absolute, uncompromising, and ruthlessly swift. Thomas Harding had not been idle in the days waiting for rescue. He had successfully recovered Director Rourke's intact, heavily encrypted data drives from the outpost main servers before the orbital bombardment severed the local network. The data contained every illegal corporate mandate, every suppressed bioweapons manifest, and the explicit, damning audio command from Rourke to initiate the Orion Protocol to murder innocent civilians and scientists. When the United Nations Interstellar Tribunal held its emergency hearings in Geneva, 2 months later, Hastings Interstellar was systematically dismantled overnight. Their stock plummeted to zero. Their board of directors was arrested by the SEC and UN military police, and their vast interstellar assets were seized to pay monumental reparations. Arthur Sterling, who had miraculously survived the bombardment by cowering in a deep-core geological bunker, was dragged out by peacekeepers and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security orbital penal colony. But the most profound shift to emerge from the ashes of Aegis VII wasn't legal, financial, or corporate. It was deeply, irrevocably cultural. For centuries, the wider galactic community had viewed humanity with a mixture of suspicion, pity, and mild disdain. Humans were the newcomers to the stars, frail, soft-skinned bipeds who relied far too heavily on volatile machines and possessed terrifyingly erratic emotions. They were considered a chaotic, unpredictable variable in a vast galaxy otherwise ruled by cold logic, overwhelming physical strength, and ancient, rigid hierarchies. But then the security footage recovered from Outpost 31 was declassified. The silent video of a tiny 5-year-old boy in blue pajamas walking up to the most lethal biological weapon in recorded history and curing its world-ending rage with a simple kiss on the snout was broadcast to every inhabited star system in Bades, the Milky Way. It broke the universe's collective mind. Alien scholars, xenobiologists, and hardened military generals from a dozen different species spent years endlessly analyzing the footage. They experienced a profound, terrifying epiphany. They realized that humanity's greatest evolutionary advantage wasn't their physical resilience, their SpaceX heritage hyperdrives, or their kinetic military doctrine. It was their pathological, universe-breaking empathy. Humans possessed a terrifying biological imperative to pack bond with literally anything that existed. They could look into the dark, unforgiving void of space, a place fundamentally filled with monsters, cosmic horrors, and endless, grinding war, and their very first instinct wasn't to build a bigger gun or hide behind a thicker wall. Their first instinct was to ask if the monster was lonely. They would look at walking extinction events and simply decide they were friends. And terrifyingly enough, the universe, unable to process this sheer audacity, bent to their will. The monsters agreed. As for Dr. Thomas Harding, he permanently retired from deep space xenobiology. Flush with the massive settlement money provided by the eunuch and the liquidation of Hastings' assets, he purchased a vast remote tract of private rolling land in the mountainous, terraformed highlands of Mars. It was a quiet, profoundly peaceful life. Victor and his silicate vanguard had flatly refused to leave the boy's side, officially registering themselves with the UN as Thomas's permanent private security detail. The massive alien warriors, once the scourge of the Orion sector, spent their golden years learning how to harvest hydroponic tomatoes and awkwardly trying to understand the rules of human board games on the porch. And living comfortably in a massive, custom-built, geothermally heated cavern adjacent to the farmhouse was Buster. The World Eater had grown quite accustomed to the lighter Martian gravity. Most afternoons, the deadliest creature in the universe could be found lying flat on its back in the tall red grass, the artificial sun warming its pristine, healed obsidian scales. Meanwhile, a slightly older, much happier Leo would climb endlessly over its massive armored ridges, pretending to conquer mountains with Barnaby the stuffed dog always close at hand. The galaxy finally understood its 3 unbreakable rules. Don't stare into a dying pulsar. Don't bargain with a desperate smuggler. And if you ever encounter a dread worm, make sure you have a human child and a stuffed golden retriever nearby. Or you are completely, irrevocably doomed. If this epic tale of humanity's universe-breaking empathy gave you chills, do us a huge favor and hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who loves incredible sci-fi stories. And make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a journey into the cosmos with us. What do you think is humanity's greatest superpower? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.